What's up, model makers? It's time for yet another update in Rube Goldberg's miniart 1/35th scale Caterpillar D7 bulldozer adventures. And there's quite a bit to talk about on this episode, although I did manage to keep it relatively short. I know. But some important progress, I think. My goal with this segment was to get to the milestone of having it sitting on its own little tracked feet, and that's exactly where I'm at. So let's take a look at what all was involved in getting there. Okay, so a couple of quick things to talk about. First thing is this subassembly with the diesel tank and the seat cushion and all of that. A word of warning, I chose to try and put this seat cushion on here after all the rest of this was assembled for what I think should be obvious reasons. Yeah, it's difficult because it does not want to go between these two armrest brackets. It'll do it if you use a little bit of leverage. I just slipped a tool in between the edge of the seat cushion and the armrest and just spread it a little bit and then pushed this down in there and it popped in fine. Both times. The reason I had to do it twice is because if you don't notice, this seat cushion is not symmetrical. It's taller in the front than it is in the back, and if you put it in the other direction, the rear seat cushion will not go on. So just something to be aware of if you're going to do it that way. The other things that I've done here, I've assembled both of the fender sub-assemblies and got a good base coat of rust on those, and those are pretty straightforward. They go together easy. The only thing to be cautious about or aware of is that these brackets that mount it to the sidewall of the tractor are not all the same. There's one that has that little stub on it that fits a notch, so just make sure that you get it into the right spot. It goes at the front of the fender. Okay, now here's where things got stupid. I have chosen to wait as long as possible to start assembling the controls for good reason, because these are the parts that everybody talks about breaking and just having disastrous issues with, and with all of the futzing around with all this other stuff that I was doing, I didn't want to take any chances. I mean, as it was, I broke off the oil filler stub on top of the transmission here, and it's lost and never to be found again. So that's why I waited, and that's why these are in here and unpainted, because I figured that it would be much easier to get them in there and then just do some masking and some really small spraying to get all these controls painted up once they're already in place. Now, this was ugly. As you can see, this entire, well, let me get the instructions. This will be easier. Okay, as you can see, that's a little sub-assembly there, and that's a pretty delicate bit of business. But the main thing to be aware of is that notch that's right there in the middle of that cross member has to clear the top of the joint between the bell housing and the transmission right there. You can kind of see how that's got to slip down. There we go. That's the right picture. How that has to slide down in between there. Now, mine did not even come close to fitting. And I think that part of that was my own fault, because the problem was that it wouldn't line up. That notch that basically it has to slip down into was not lined up properly with the two notches that each end of the cross member is supposed to fit into. And I think the problem is that on closer inspection that I may not have had the back end of the transmission completely seated in the back part of the frame right there, and so it being a little too far forward is what caused the problem. So what I ended up doing was just basically hogging the material out of the bottom of that cross member and just getting medieval on its ass and jamming it down in there. Now, in the process of doing that, of course, I broke one of these actuator rods. But overall, I guess, I managed to get it done in reasonably decent fashion, even though these foot pedals were all cockeyed looking once I got it done. And so I had to resort to my trick of softening things up with some Tamiya extra thin and sort of pushing things around a little bit. But all's well that ends well. And because all of this is going to be totally covered up with the floorboards, it's not really a big issue. In fact, I could have just basically chopped away everything and been really brutish about it. But I wanted to do it as much as right as possible. Because one of the cool things about this kit is that you could build it in pretty much any state of undress you wanted to and have all of this wonderful detail showing. And even if you did have some problems in doing that, the truth is that all of this section right here underneath the floorboards would be covered completely with oil-soaked dirt. And that's something that I can tell you from direct experience with this kind of equipment. So unless you were building a pristine brand new tractor and you wanted to show all of this detail in here, a few little issues with construction wouldn't be too big of a deal, including having to clean up the mini gate attachments that are on these long skinny parts. And as you can see, I've chosen to leave them on that actuator rod that runs from the throttle lever until everything is all firmed up, and then I'm going to come back with a really sharp blade and clean that up. And if I end up breaking that off, that's an easy replacement with a piece of straight lead wire or styrene rod. So not too big of a deal there. And now I can move on to the next set of long skinny levers that I'm sure will be a disaster. Since I am pretty far into this part of the thing with all of these levers, I thought I would just say a quick word about tactics. Strategy is the overall thing. How am I going to put this thing together so that I can paint it? And tactics are the little actions that you take to get those things done. Now, some tactics for getting these levers off of here unbroken, which I've been able to do, except in this one case where it was broken before I even touched it. First, if that happens and you notice it, the best time to fix it is while it's still attached to the sprue, because you're never going to have a better alignment jig than the sprue itself. So just a little bit of Tamiya extra thin right there at the brake, which was just above that, just below that handle and before that first gate. Then when it comes time to actually cut these things off, something that I've figured out is to start at the end and kind of unzip it. So in other words, start your clipping here and then go here and then go here and then go here and then come down here and go here and then here and then save this one for last. Now, the reason that I chose that particular order, well, first of all, working from the end gets you the advantage of having this little spindly piece of plastic is now just waving in the air, and it's only constrained on one end, which is the next gate, and that makes it less likely for you to break it than if you just started working here in the middle and you've got constraints on either side of your cut, and that, more constraints means more strain on it that can cause it to snap. Anyway, so that's why you start from one end and work towards the other. But why I chose this one as my last bit is because it's the strongest. Let's take, for example, this little bitty part right here, this this lever that you can see right there. Okay, notice that it's got the long lever sticking up there. It's not in focus very well. But it's also got then that linkage. Okay, and you can see the sprue gates all over it. That linkage is the weakest part of the whole structure. And so you don't want to leave it as the last thing that's holding on to everything, because again, that could overstress it and cause it to snap. So anyway, just a little bit of thinking about how I'm going about getting these parts off of these sprues and trying to avoid the horror of having a bunch of broken levers. Okay, here's another tactic. Got these straight levers right here, and I've gone ahead and clipped the gates off of them in the way that I was talking about before. But then I also got rid of some sprue material around them so that I've now got a perfect holder that allows me to come along and clean up the gate remnants in those two spots here and here with my super sharp brand new X-Acto blade. And I've got this, it's this little bitty piece here is perfectly secure while I do that. So that's half of the gate cleanup that I have to do. Then what I'm doing on all these also is I'm taking my Tamiya extra thin and with just a little bit on the brush, come along and just go over those gates that I cleaned up. What that does is kind of just think of it as sort of a chemical polish, if you will. It just burnishes down, melts down any little sort of fuzzy things that might be left over after you've trimmed those. And there you go. Not too bad. A little bit of a notch in that one, but it's not going to show. So, I am in a bit of a rage at the moment, and we are going to talk about why. This is a story of how crappy instructions combined with unnecessarily tight tolerances can really wreak unnecessary havoc on your life. Let's first of all take a look at the instructions. Hold on one second while I grab the offending page. Okay, see right here. This is where you are going to allegedly install the floorboards. And you're going to do this after having installed all of the control levers and the structure that goes around the outside of that part of the frame. And I had in fact done that. I had all 6 or 5, I guess, of the control levers in, and was feeling pretty good about it. I had also, based on what I saw here and what seemed to make sense, without any deeper examination, assembled parts C105, 106, and 58 into that floorboard section. Now, let me tell you that if you do that, and then attempt to slide that floorboard section down over the top of all of these levers and structures, you are going to have a bad time. Now, fortunately, I had been warned about this and had been kind of looking out for it. But what I didn't really realize is that the fatal flaw in the instructions is the way that they lead you into assembling this whole floorboard section into one piece before you put it onto the tractor itself. Because that thing, given the position of the levers up at the top, you can see that like these two levers, the steering levers are pretty far apart up here at the top and pretty close together down here at the bottom. Plus you've got this lever over here, and then you've got these two levers. There's a lever going through this side, or through this cutout, and through this one, which, as you can see, I've obviously removed. There's just too there's just too damn many things going on at once for that to be a realistic possibility. Fortunately, the two levers that go over here had not solidified, and so popping them back off of there was not too big of a deal. But the real thing that I should have done differently is taken each of these two sections of the floorboard and brought them in separately and glued them in place, and then added this piece across the back here, which would have been way easier than assembling them by themselves anyway, because getting this piece assembled to these two pieces at a right angle, just sitting on the bench, was really kind of a pain in the ass itself. And having these two halves of the floorboard separate would have made everything that's going on here a lot easier. So that is definitely my recommendation. I would also recommend that you consider opening up the holes for the steering levers that you can see right here a little bit. I mean, this is ridiculous. If these holes were 50% larger, everything here would have been much, much easier. And there's just no excuse for miniart not knowing that and dealing with that for you. Because they put you in a position of having to do, at least in my case, some very ugly model making. I got it done, but not happy with the gyrations that I had to go through to get there. So just definitely something to be cautious about when you get to this section. So do you ever have one of those modeling situations where you get done with something and you sort of end up feeling like you just got away with one? Well, as you can see, I have returned my attention to the tracks. And that's kind of how I'm feeling about it at this point. This is the only tracks I've put together. The rest are still in little containers of parts because I've been procrastinating, and I've been procrastinating on this thing because I just was dreading assembling the four sections that I had, because I knew that there were several places in here where I had done a terrible job and used a little too much Tamiya extra thin, and I had adjacent pads stuck together and they wouldn't pivot. So I was very negative about my prospects of actually getting the damn thing wrapped around this track carriage, and I was surprised that it went as well as it did. As you can see, I managed to somehow get this thing clocked well enough that the parts of my track section that are still flexible were in the right places to go around the drive wheel and the road wheel. So good news there. Now, a little bit of a trick that I pulled, or a cheat, whatever you want to call it. If you look here close, you'll notice that I've got some odd looking pins here and here and here. And I'm calling it a cheat, but I honestly don't know what else I could have done, because here's the deal. When you go to join, let's say, this end to the other end, all right, you're going to have a male-female situation there. And the only way that you're going to be able to get a pin through all four of those link plates is obviously if you can poke it through from one side and poke it all the way through. Now, I don't know if this is just something that miniart just totally overlooked, or if they expect you to just sort of figure something else out on your own or what, but I don't think you have to be a genius to see that with these pins being shouldered on each end, and the smaller diameter being the ID of the hole in the outer section of the link plates, But there is no way you're going to take one of those pins and slide it all the way through from one side to the other. That is just physically impossible. Ain't going to happen. So what I ended up doing was, where I had to make that join, is just cut myself a short piece of 1 millimeter evergreen styrene rod. Now 1 millimeter is about 0.3 millimeters too small, as you can see, but hey, it kind of is what it is, and by the time I cover all this crap up with some mud and dirt and rust, I don't think anybody's going to be able to tell. So there it is. That's the situation with that, with the tracks as it stands right now. I've also carried on some more with weathering the rest of the assembly, and I got a little progress to show there. As you can see, I've done lots of painting and rusting and chipping, and have about got myself where I'm reasonably happy with it for what I would sort of consider the basic paint work. You can kind of see how it's going to look with the seat and everything on there. I managed to escape all of this horror with only one little disaster, and that was this lever handle that was already broken off on the sprue. I ended up snapping it off again as I was, busily doing my chipping work. But if that's as bad as it gets, then I think I can handle it. Especially after the chafe that was getting the floorboard pieces all properly installed. I also came back after I showed some pictures of this thing to Mike Rinaldi, and he said, some of your chips look a little too big, and I had to agree. The more I looked at it on this side, that there was just too much brown, and I just didn't like it. So I just came back with a couple of more applications of paint and chipping fluid, or the Scratches Effects rather, that I've been using. And you can see that because of slight differences in the color of the paint and just being able to work that I don't know if it'll show up on camera that well, but I'm getting some nice tonal variation in there, and that's really where the magic happens. I also put some more paint on back here and cut down on the amount of large chips that I had, and tried to sort of focus it down there on the bottom, closest to where the implement hitch is, and where you would see the most abuse. So I think that looks better. It was just a little too noisy before, and I think now is an improvement. And that is where all of that stands right now. Okay, so a little bit of an update on my tracks. Take two. It's take two because I had already sort of talked about this, but then I carelessly deleted that segment from my card before I got it saved on my hard drive. So no big deal. I can say it again, although I can't quite demonstrate one thing that I had talked about in that segment, and that is how I had improved my technique on gluing these tracks together. As I had mentioned in the last segment, this segment was ugly. A lot of sections were not flexible, and fortunately, I was able to get it fitted onto the carriage with some drama, but ultimately I was able to make it work. What I ended up having to do in several locations was basically glue it down with super glue in areas where it looked good, and then in areas where things were not going so well, like right here, I basically just doused the inside of that area with some Tamiya Extra Thin, even after doing all of this weathering. Softened it up enough that I could form it into a shape that was decent, especially since this section right here is going to be covered with the dozer frame, which I'll talk about in a second. The main thing about how I improved my technique is that I was just much more careful with my glue. And so this other track section is pretty much 100% flexible. I lost one segment in my weathering because, as I said before, I wanted to get about 80% of the pigments and things applied. And I think I got one joint that just got stuck together too completely with pigments and pigment fixer. So that's a little bit of a hassle, but it's a much better situation than the previous one was. So I think I'll be able to deal with that. Now, speaking of the dozer frame, I've got that right here, and it bears mentioning. What I did basically to get this thing set up to where I could paint it as a separate subassembly was I glued it temporarily onto the, get the correct track carriage here. I glued it temporarily onto the track carriage and with masking fluid, and held it in place in my, hold on a minute here. This is not, this is not going well. It comes off very easily, as you can see, which is great for what I'm trying to do, but not great for demonstration purposes. Anyway, look, the thing goes on there like that. It pops off very easily. So what I did is I basically just assembled it on there temporarily, got everything glued up with Tamiya extra thin, and then popped it back off like this. And as you can see, I've done some filler work here where I'm going to have to sand that down, because this is a single chunk of metal here and a single chunk of metal here on the real thing that's joined by that riveted plate there in the middle. So I'll smooth all that up before I get on with painting those two pieces. The other thing, I guess, to sort of update is the remainder of the work that I've been doing on the chassis. You can see here that I've got the seat all installed, and I've done some oil paint rendering on that to simulate the butt effect of getting all the dirt shoved over into the crevices and the sides. So I think that looks pretty decent, and I hope old Mike Rinaldi would be proud of me for my work on that part. Well, what a difference an hour can make. An hour ago, when I finished the last clip, I thought that the rest of this was going to have a happy ending. That because I had basically 100% flexibility on this other run of tracks, that it was going to just essentially wrap itself around this other track carriage, and I would join the ends and we would all ride off into the sunset. Well, that is not what happened, and I probably should not be making this video clip right now because I am so pissed off I can hardly see straight. And given that Kitmaker Network wants me to keep the profanity out of these videos, this might not go well. Anyway, here's what happened. This track run did indeed wrap effortlessly around this track carriage. But when I went to connect the two ends, it appeared to be one link too long. Now I knew this couldn't be possible. There are 36 track pads in each track assembly, and I even counted them just to make sure that I hadn't lost my mind. And there were not 37, regardless of how it looked. And I can't explain it. I don't know why the thing looked like it was so long. I have compared everything that I can think of between the two assemblies. The idler wheel at the front is in the same position on both of them. It might be a millimeter or a half millimeter further inboard on this one than it is on this one. But that doesn't explain the huge discrepancy that I had. I mean, I almost could have taken an entire link out of this chain of tracks and had the thing fit on there. But of course, it was about a half a pin too short to be able to do that, and it would have ended up looking ridiculous if I had tried that. So that is not what I attempted to do, and I will explain in this recording what I actually ended up doing. Basically, I joined the tracks up here at the top and put as much slack into them as possible, and then went ahead and wrapped them around the road wheel. And then basically I destroyed the entire bottom section. I mean, literally destroyed. All these little pieces that you see right here are the remnants of what I did there. Essentially, after all that work to join all of these track plates together, I broke every single one of these apart from about right here to right here so that I could just essentially glue the track pads to the bottom of the track carriage in a way that looked about right, and then essentially embalmed all of them in super glue, which you can see right here. So anyway, the thing looks okay. I think it's going to pass inspection, but needless to say, I am entirely frustrated with the situation. And you know, it is possible that I'm just an idiot and that I did not do a good job of putting these tracks together. That's always possible. But I don't think so. And here's the reason why. Number one is I know I'm not a mechanical idiot. I've been putting complicated things together since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Here is the other piece of evidence that I will submit in my defense. This is Rinaldi's SM02 book, which conveniently is about a bulldozer project. And this is the Trumpeter S65. Now, take a look at this picture here on this page. Take a close look at these track pieces. Notice how each track pad has actual holes in it, and each one of these link plates has actual pins molded onto it so that you get actual engagement between the three parts that form each one of those link sub-assemblies. This is what I'm talking about when I say that miniart just committed a major engineering fail with this track assembly system. And I don't feel like I'm off base at all in calling them out on that. I just feel like that I would almost, if I were going to build one of these again, I would probably buy the Trumpeter kit and use their tracks just to avoid having to deal with miniart on this issue. Now, another thing, since I'm busy slamming them on silly things, there is a place, and I don't know if I highlighted this when I was going through it, where we had to perform some ridiculous operations on these two idler wheels right here. And I'm going to go into the instruction book and show you that, because this is another bit of silliness that will cause you problems if you are not prepared to deal with it. Okay, right here is where they have you assemble the idler wheel sub-assemblies and their standoffs. You can see that right there where they mount to the track carriage, and this right here is where you put all that together. Now, if you'll notice right there at the bottom, they give you a little bit of hieroglyphics that tell you to remove almost 0.5 millimeter off the inside of each one of those idler wheel halves. Now, I challenge you to do that and do it where each face is still perpendicular to the axle. I managed to get it close enough in 3 out of 4 of them, but on one of them, it's actually on this other track run, the thing just came out so crooked that there was no way that the ridges on the track idler wheel would fit between the link plates, like you can see that it's supposed to do there. And I had to do a little bit of ugly model making to get that to look right. And I was able to do it once again, but I had to use the old Marine Corps adage of improvise and adapt to make that work. And I don't know why those idler wheels are not the correct size to start with, but that is a bunch of ridiculousness, and miniart should fix that. Okay, I'm done ranting. I'm going to shut this segment down before things get any uglier. Okay, I know I keep promising that I've done the last segment for this episode of the bulldozer build, but I keep coming back to things that seem worthy of talking about. So anyway, here we are looking at the belly of the beast, and this particular point involves This step in the instructions looks like it's, I don't know, step 19. And if you look right here, there's a couple of pieces, B41 and B40, that go down into that lower plate, and they want you to make sure and get no glue on those. Now, that's because they're going to need to be movable. You're going to need to be able to rotate them, because later on, much later on, when you've got the tracks all assembled, you're going to be inserting that chicken wing looking piece into the notch, or the hole rather, on that little gizmo right there. Now, the reason that we are talking about this is because it's pretty difficult, if not impossible, to tell from looking at the instructions that even though part B40 and B41 are pretty much identical, there is in fact an orientation involved in installing them. And the reason being because there is, at the end of this chicken wing shaped piece, and I'm going to try and get something to point with, there's one of these goofy little half round joints. So if you look right here, there's a small rod that inserts into the hole on this piece right here. And it's got this half round thing on it that's supposed to mate with the other half round gizmo on here. Now, in order for that to take place correctly, the half round part on this has to be on the bottom. In other words, closest to the ground. And if you do like I did and you're not paying attention and you swap the left one and the right one, then your little half round notch joint right here is not going to mate up the way that it should, and you'll actually have this space in here, and it won't be quite right. Now, I sort of solved that problem with a little bit of cutting and filing and got everything to go together about right, and nobody's going to be looking down here much, I hope. So probably never to be seen again after this video segment, but just fair warning, this is another one of those situations where not paying close attention combined with some sort of questionable engineering decisions can cause you some problems down the road, because you'll be able to put parts in incorrectly and not even know you did it until it's way too late. The other thing is, make certain that you don't get any glue in here in your later operations. Somehow in all of this assembly, I managed to get a tiny bit of glue in here, and I was not able to spin one of these around to the correct orientation, and I ended up having to chop it out of there. Fortunately, I had a brand spanking new Tamiya razor saw on hand, and I was able to pretty surgically remove that thing and get everything corrected. So no harm, no foul, all's well that ends well. So anyway, that's the story, and I promise that is the last thing I'm going to talk about until the next episode. Okay, so there you go. Yeah, things got a little off the rails there. Apologies for the meltdown. This, this kid has been a real adventure. It's been a little bit of love-hate. I love it because it's a fantastic subject. I really, I'm a fan of miniart for picking subjects like this. I wish more model kit companies would go after this kind of stuff, because to me it's just so interesting, and being civilian, there are just so many possibilities because you don't have to limit yourself to military correct colors or anything like that. And I love it because they've done such a fantastic job of reproducing the real thing in miniature. I mean, in so many ways, the thing goes together like the real thing would. But on the hate side, and there are some significant reasons to hate this kit. I think that this illustrates something that I've thought about quite a bit, and that is that if I had to guess, and this is just a guess, but this is based on my knowledge of CAD and engineering and 3D design and all of that sort of stuff. If I had to guess, I would suspect that a lot of the guys doing the design work for these model kits are not actually engineers. And here's why I say that. There was a time 15 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, when 3D computer design was strictly the purview of engineers. Partly because they're the only people who really needed to be able to do it, and partly because the software that was involved was so expensive that it was only engineering organizations that could justify the expense. Now, the movie guys have been doing computer-generated 3D stuff for 30 years, but the level of sophistication on that side of things wasn't nearly where it was on the engineering side. But those two things have kind of converged in the last 5 to 10 years. And so as a result, you can buy 3D CAD packages or 3D design packages like Rhino, for example, that cost $500, and the same guy who is producing really cool 3D objects for online video games like World of Tanks can produce a 3D data file that can be turned into tool steel. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be good tool steel, because what's completely missing there is the engineering that goes into, creating a plastic injection mold. That same guy might also not even be a scale modeler, may have no connection to or experience with scale modeling. And so what you've got is the capability to render a perfect digital reproduction of an actual physical object from the real world without a lot of consideration of how it's going to get produced or how it's going to get assembled by the scale modeler. And so you've got this giant disconnect that results in kits that have this fantastic level of detail but are a real pain in the ass to put together because they're not engineered with an eye towards buildability. So I think that that's kind of what's happening here. Hey, I guess that's a good problem to have, because we can deal with most of the issues of buildability a lot better than we can deal with having to build all of this fantastic detail from scratch. So it's good because this puts a level of detail at an accessibility level for the average model maker that it never would have been before. It's a bad thing because it's going to scare a lot of those guys away from trying something like this when they hear about what a hassle some of these kits are. So I don't know, it's a mixed bag, and I didn't really mean to go off on a tangent on that or waffle about it, but I think that that kind of addresses what's happening with kits like this. The bottom line is that the thing is going to build up into an incredibly cool little miniature bulldozer, and I can't wait to see how it turns out. I hope you guys are as interested in that result as I am, and that you'll stay tuned. If you've been watching for this long, I really appreciate it. And I'll see you next time. Much love.